Well, hello and welcome back to our study of the Psalms. We are in Psalm chapter 3 today. And it's important to note before we dive into this psalm that Psalm 3 has a context. If you notice the words that come right before verse 1, you see a little bit of that context. It says something like this: a psalm of David regarding the time he fled from his son Absalom. So let me just share with you what was going on when David wrote these words. I think it'll be helpful. I think it'll be really helpful. David had a daughter named Tamar, and David had a son from a different wife named Amnon. And Amnon thought that he was in love with his sister, and he was so sick that he couldn't have her. And so one day, he takes matters into his own hands. And it's a very dark time in the history of David's family. But anyway, he asks Tamar to bring him some food, and when she is there, he rapes her. She tries to reason with him before he violates her. She says, "Don't do this. Just ask David and he will give me to you as a wife. Just don't do this." But Amnon doesn't listen. In his lust, he rapes his half-sister. Right after that, it's interesting that the scripture says Amnon's love for Tamar turned into hatred. Interesting. Amnon had a full brother named Absalom, and we're going to skip some of the details, but Absalom ultimately, because David didn't do anything about what happened, takes matters into his own hand and he kills his brother Amnon. David is beside himself with grief, and Absalom flees from the city. Now, to make a long story just a little bit longer, ultimately Absalom rebels against David and gathers his own army and fights against King David, actually drives King David out of Jerusalem and into the mountains in hiding. And that is when David writes these words of Psalm chapter 3. Let's read them together. Psalm chapter 3. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. Before we get into the rest of the psalm, let me mention this. Whenever you see those words Selah, or maybe your version says interlude on the side of a psalm, what that is, it's simply a pause for emphasis' sake. In other words, David is saying, take a break. Go back and reread those words that I just wrote slowly. In this instance, the first Selah that we see is after what others are saying about David in verse 2. The second Selah is after what God has done by answering David's cry in verse 3. And so David is saying to us, despite what others were saying, God answered. And he says, I want you to think about that. I want you to take that in, slowly understand that truth. Now, I don't know about you, but knowing the backstory to this psalm makes it even more interesting. You see, when David cries out about his enemies here in Psalm 3, you need to know his very own son is included in that number. Now, here's what I love about this psalm. It comes in verses 3 through 6. David declares something. He declares God his shield, his glory, and the one who holds up his head. And one more thing in the middle of these verses, David says, I was able to lay down and sleep and wake up in safety. He was able to do that despite all of the adversity and all of the chaos and all of the uncertainty that was going on in his life because God was with him. I don't know about you, but that's not often me. When my stress level is off the charts, sleep is often hard to come by. I can't turn my mind off. I toss and I turn and I struggle through those sleepless nights. And not a lot of fun to be around in those moments. And I just wonder as I read this psalm, could it be that I'm not doing what David was doing? Could it be that I'm trusting in myself rather than in Jesus? Well, what are you trusting in? You see, despite all that's going on around him, David had a sense of peace and he had no fear. And David knows that victory and blessings come from the Lord. I want to share with you 3 takeaways that I think we get here from Psalm chapter 3. And here's number 1. Thinking back to those earlier Selahs that we talked about, here's number 1. People are going to say all kinds of things. But God is not bound to answer the way people think He should. right? God is God and we are not, and neither are the people who are crying out against us, and God can do whatever He wants. He is not forced to answer the way people think He should. And that leads to takeaway number 2. You can rest in peace despite any trouble coming at you when you trust in God rather than in yourself or in your resources or whatever else is out there. You see, it is God who brings victory. It is God who brings blessing. It is God who is our shield and our glory, and it is God who is the lifter of our heads. Yes, David should have done something to Amnon after what he did to his sister. He should have disciplined Absalom when he killed him. But when I see David call God the lifter of his head, here's what I see. This is just me. David knows he's not been the father that he should have been. He knows that he should have done something about all of this so much earlier. He's discouraged. He's ashamed. And yet God takes hold of his chin and says, "Look at me, David. I'm not giving up on you despite your failures." And listen, God's not going to give up on us either. Now, that doesn't mean that God is happy when we fail, but He doesn't remove His love from failures. I want you to hear that. You need to hear that because you have failed and you will fail again. And guess what? I will be included in your number, but God doesn't give up on us when we fail. Here's the third truth. God doesn't care about the odds. David says, "So many are against me." And he adds later, I'm not afraid of 10,000 enemies who surround me on every side. The implication is David is outnumbered and he's surrounded, but he has God and he knows that that is enough. If you're a follower of Jesus, He is on your side too. You may feel outnumbered and outmatched, but God doesn't care about the odds. And remember how this psalm ends. I love it. He says, "Victory comes from you, O Lord." That's right. Victory doesn't come from superior forces. It doesn't come from superior resources. No, victory comes from God. So put your trust and put your obedience in the one who lifts our heads and gives us victory. That's Psalm chapter 3. I want to encourage you to head on over to our podcast as we dig a little bit deeper here into this great psalm. Thanks for listening. I'll see you right back here next week for Psalm chapter 4. God bless you.